the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2026. Our first item of business is to decide whether to take items 4 and 5 in private. Are we all agreed? Yeah. Thank you. Our next item of business is an oral evidence session on Legislative Consent Memorandum LCM S673. This LCM has been lodged by the Scottish Government in relation to the Armed Forces UK Bill. Members will wish to note that the Scottish Government is recommending consent to the provisions in the memorandum and that there are ongoing discussions in relation to some other provisions in the bill, which I understand may be the subject of legislative consent motion in the next parliamentary session. So I welcome to the meeting the Minister for Parliamentary Business and Veterans, Graham Day. I also welcome officials from the Scottish Government, Well Done Veterans Unit, and Claire McKinlay, Solicitor Legal Directorate. So I invite the Minister to make some brief opening remarks on the LCM. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me along to discuss the UK Armed Forces Bill and the associated legislative consent memorandum. As you'll be aware, the Armed Forces Bill 2026 was introduced to the House of Commons on Thursday, the 15th of January. The main purpose of the bill is to renew the Armed Forces Act 2006, which must be renewed every 5 years and was last renewed in 2021. There's been extensive engagement on this bill between officials and with the UK Minister for the Armed Forces in particular, and I want to acknowledge and welcome that. The majority of the bill's provisions have been assessed as relating to reserve matters, but there is one substantive measure within the bill which it has been agreed engages the LCM process, and that's the extension of the duty to have due regard to the principles of the Armed Forces Covenant to central government, including the functions of Scottish ministers and the expansion of the duty to cover a significantly increased number of policy areas. These will include childcare, education and training, employment, health and social care, housing, social security benefits, personal taxation, criminal justice, transport, pensions, immigration and citizenship, along with armed forces compensation. The expansion of the Covenant duty accordingly has the potential to impact on a wide range of Scottish Government policy areas. However, the Scottish Government has always been highly supportive of the aims of the Armed Forces Covenant since its introduction in 2011. The principles of the Covenant that service personnel, veterans and their families should suffer no disadvantage in accessing support or services as a result of their military service already underpin our veterans strategy and our support for the armed forces community more widely. We welcome the extension of the Covenant duty and the opportunity it represents to ensure greater awareness of and consistency of support for our armed forces community. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice has therefore recommended we consent to the bill as introduced in full. And I'm happy to take questions, Convener.
Thank you very much, Minister. So I'll kick off with the first question. And again, what will change as a result of the new duty that's placed on Scottish ministers by this bill?
Well, I think there's a wider aspect to it, which is what will be improved in terms of the experience of the armed forces community and their families as a result of this. I think it does two things. I think it will focus minds amongst public bodies about the need to have regard to the Covenant. I think it will help some members of the Armed Forces and Veterans community in understanding what the Covenant does and doesn't do, because there is a misunderstanding amongst some that it provides for advantage rather than no disadvantage. So that will be helpful. And in the context of the Scottish Government, I think it will in reality make little difference, because I am more than content with our approach to dealing with the armed forces community and veterans. But of course it's helpful that there is something there now that reminds everyone of the need to engage in this process to ensure that our communities are not disadvantaged because of their service. I think it's quite helpful.
Okay, no, thank you for that response, and that is very reassuring as well. I'm now going to invite Bob Dodison. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. Good morning, Minister. I suppose I welcome this, the first thing to say, Minister, but I've got a couple of questions. I'm happy for the responses even to be relatively brief and maybe followed up in correspondence. The first thing is, it's put on record, is I'm really pleased that it appears now we've got a committee who will scrutinise these matters on an ongoing basis. Maybe that's been slightly lacking in the Parliament, so maybe if the successor committee can follow through how Scotland is delivering for veterans would be a really positive thing more generally. And I see the Minister's embraced the additional duties placed on government, and there's nothing to fear. But my substantive question, I suppose, in relation to education and training, for example, Minister, for me there would be a sheer space there. If someone has given up 15, 20 years of their life to the military, the Ministry of Defence and the UK Government has got a duty and a responsibility to manage a transition back into civilian life in a dignified, respectful and meaningful way for armed forces veterans. I've not looked at any particular detail on how well they do or don't do that, Minister, but what's the connection between a UK Government and the UK military saying, well, education and training is a devolved matter to the Scottish Parliament, it's for you to have due regard to this, we've done our bit. I'm sure that's not the nature of the discussions, Minister, but I suppose what reassurance can you give that there will be ongoing dialogue to make sure this shared space for veterans is suitably resourced, not just by the Scottish Government, but on an ongoing basis by the UK Government?
So to deal with your first point first, I too welcome the fact that that scrutiny will be in place. I think it's been a bugbear for some people in the Parliament that there hasn't been that necessary interaction with the veterans and the support that we provide through committees. I think that's helpful. I'll say that given that I'm leaving in 2 weeks' time. Mr Doris touches on a really important point. If we're honest about it, the transition experience of a lot of our military has been quite poor, but it has been improving. I think the UK Government have gotten better at the support they provide people who are transitioning out of the military, but it could always be better. So too could our offering. We did a substantial piece of work when I was last in this role around translating military qualifications into civilian qualifications, because the military qualifications in the UK military are based on the English education system. So the read across for employers was not always what it could have been. So there's been extensive work done in that space. We have some good examples of our colleges and our universities engaging here, but I would readily acknowledge, Mr Doris, there's still some work to be done there. If this refresh of the Covenant assists that, then all to the good, but I think above and beyond that, we need to look, we've got ground to make up collectively here, because it can't just be about ensuring that when someone leaves the military, they have a job to go to. It has to be something that maximises and taps into the talents they've acquired. And unfortunately, we've gone through a period where perhaps all too often, particularly people leaving the army, have not entirely understood the skill set that they have developed. It's important that the MOD and the military ensure that that's done at their end before people transition out. And I think we need to do more to raise awareness of the opportunities that are being provided. But if I say to you that the Scottish Government as an employer has over the last few years become much more active in that space, recruiting from the military itself. We don't do that out of altruism, we do it because we're recruiting a very skilled and motivated workforce. And as I repeat, we could always do better, and I think that's what I will hope to see my successor as Veterans Minister continue that work.
I think I find that encouraging. Can I just put on the record with brevity, I promise, just two veterans who have spoken to me in recent months. I mean, you've corresponded with the Minister in relation to this. One made the point, it's a long time since they were serving in the armed forces, that when they joined the armed forces, Glasgow City Council had council housing. Promises were made about housing and accommodation. Housing stock transfers had occurred since then, and those promises couldn't be fulfilled. So this duty on public bodies in Scotland could have a real impact in proper coordinated service design and delivery for veterans. I just believe that on the record. Another veteran who said to me the other day, and I make no case for or against this, we just feel as if there's something symbolic about how Scotland is supporting veterans. And they said, for example, some bus companies are now rolling out free bus travel for veterans. Could that not be extended across the country in a structured way by government? I just leave that sitting there. You don't need to respond, Minister, but it's just that if my constituents are saying this to me and I've got the opportunity this morning, I simply wanted to put that on the record.
Briefly, Convener, if I may. On housing, there are some very good examples across Scotland where local authorities have a relationship with the veterans community, and it would be recognised by them as such. But it can be patchy. I agree with you. I think this will help focus minds. I should also say there are some housing associations who have a very good track record in this space. I would just make one point to you about your latter point. I'm less interested in symbolism and more interested in delivery. And whilst it might be symbolic to do certain things, this has got to be about improving the lived experience of our veterans community across Scotland. I'll give you a brief example. The Veterans Rail Card is a very good thing, but I've had conversations with the UK Government about the restrictions on it. In some regards, it is more effective for those veterans living in Scotland over a certain age to access the senior rail card. They get more of a return on that. And I think that's a piece of work that I would hope to see develop with the UK Government to try and maximise the provision in the Veterans Rail Card.
That's really helpful, Convener. I should just say that the veteran spoke to me about the bus pass and made the point about they could use it to meet up with colleagues who are now dispersed across Scotland and beyond in relation to keep that connection from the Armed Forces days. But I agree with everything you've said, Minister.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Alexander Stewart in. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I will, like many, I welcome the progress we have here, and I do acknowledge that it will focus minds, and I think that's vitally important in the process. And the bill will have local authorities and health boards will have to take due regard to what happens with reference to the Covenant in a wide range of their public functions. And I do believe that is a good thing for us to be doing and ensuring that that does take place. But can the Minister explain further why the legislative consent is not required for this?
I'll bring Claire in on that point.
So the Armed Forces Covenant already applies to certain functions of local authorities and health bodies in Scotland. So this bill does not change that. The legislative consent motion here relates only to the extension of the same duty to the functions of the Scottish ministers in the wider range of policy areas that are now included in the Covenant. So it's an expansion of the duty.
Yeah, I think what you're alluding to, Mr Stewart, is the patchy nature of what's offered. Now, we have local authority armed forces and veterans champions. We have NHS champions. There are some excellent local authority champions. I think you'll be aware of the one from Perth and Kinross Council that you served on, Chris Ahern, who's first class. But sometimes for our local authority champions, the lack of support, officer support, gets in the way. Perhaps the lack of training to allow them to understand their role as veterans champion. So along with the Champions Network, we've been trying to address some of that, to raise awareness. And I think this, the publicity around the refresh of the Veterans Covenant will help in that regard. But we are keen to work with these representatives at local authority level to enhance their status and to encourage COSLA and the local authorities to put resource behind them in order to have them champion self-evidently the cause of our veterans community, our armed forces community and their families.
Thank you.
I'm now going to invite Claire Baker in. Thanks.
Thank you. No. Thank you, Convener. I'm pleased that the LCM is here this morning and that there's a recommendation to approve the LCM. It was just a question around Clause 6 and Schedule 3, which I understand there's still ongoing discussions between the Scottish and UK governments about whether legislative consent is required. And it makes changes to service justice system in relation to prosecuting domestic abuse. So it's just whether, obviously we're coming to the end of the session, whether we can expect to see this or an update on how those discussions are going.
I'll bring Claire in and I'll speak to the detail of it.
So again, in the last few days, excuse me, we've had further engagement at official level with Ministry of Defence, and it's been agreed that the legislative consent process does not extend to Clause 3 and that little part of Schedule 3, simply just because of the reserved nature of the provision that's made.
That's helpful, thank you.
And I think that's symptomatic, Ms Baker, of the really good working that's been going on both at official and ministerial level on this. There's been a very collaborative approach. I meet monthly with Al Carnes from the UK Government, my ministerial counterpart, and we're both absolutely committed, not only to getting this right, but to try and iron out any problems, because I know committees get very frustrated and the Parliament get frustrated if there's supplementary LCMs required, and sometimes that's unavoidable, but we're working very hard to get this right at the first time of asking.
Thank you.
Concludes our questions. Is the committee content to recommend to the Parliament that consent should be given for the relevant provisions covered by LCM S673?
Consent.
Okay.
Convener, see before we move on, given this is possibly the last time of the Minister for Parliamentary Business in front of us, and the Herculean challenges that he's had the last few weeks trying to make Parliament deliver on all the legislation still to be disposed of. I can put on my record my thanks to the Minister for all his efforts over not just the short period but over the longer term within the Parliament.
No, thanks very much, Bobby, and I think on behalf of the committee we all echo that, and good luck in the future as well. Thank you very much. So are members content to delegate responsibility to myself and the clerks to draft a report to the Parliament on the LCM? Yes. Okay. So thank you, Minister, and thank you to your officials as well. We'll have a short suspension to allow for a change of witnesses. Thanks, Bob. Welcome back. Our next item of business is our evidence session on the Scottish Government's response to Adele Harris's independent review of adult disability payment. And I welcome to the meeting Craig Smith, Public Affairs and Policy Manager for Scottish Action for Mental Health. We have Keith Park, Senior Policy, Public Affairs and Campaigns Manager, Scotland for the MS Society. And we have Frank McKillop, Director of Governance and Policy, Enable, and Erica Young, Senior Policy Officer, Social Justice from Citizens Advice Scotland. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm going to go straight into the questions. And the first questions in terms of a people service. Again, happy to open it up to each of you as well. But what are the witnesses' sort of kind of general reflections on the response from the Scottish Government to the actual review of the ADP? And I'll hand over to Craig first of all. See you nodding at me. Thanks.
First, thank you very much for inviting me here to give evidence. So I think our overall feelings about the response to the independent review from the government is, while I welcome the fact that they have accepted a number of recommendations, particularly around kind of processes, we're pretty disappointed that the much more fundamental change that the review rightly calls for in terms of changes to the actual structure of ADP to move away from the kind of framework that we have as a legacy of PIP have been sort of kind of parked. I suppose my reflection would be the government chose the timing of the independent review and the terms of reference to the review. I mean, at the time we argued actually for a wider terms of reference of the review to include key issues such as adequacy of ADP. But very much the review was rightly focused on, now that we've come to a place where safe and secure transfer is complete, so everyone is now moved over from PIP to ADP, the time is very much right to look at that fundamental reform of the underlying structures of the benefit to see how we can better improve people's rights and dignity. And it's quite disappointing that key issues that were recommended for by Adele, such as abolishing the 50% rule, having a look at the descriptors and activities and eligibility more widely, have kind of been parked to post-election, particularly using a framing of, one, the election, when we all knew that an election was coming up, and I think the government could maybe be a wee bit more generous in terms of accepting the direction of travel, if anything, in terms of recommendations, but also the financial framing of it. Absolutely recognise finances are challenging at the moment, and that obviously we don't want to ignore that, but a lot of the argument that the government presented was very much around having to be very cautious because of that financial framework, and not really providing the evidence behind some of the financial costs that they kind of came up with that they thought would be the cost of implementing the recommendations in full. So overall, yes, definitely. There's things to welcome in terms of the government's response around acceptance of process changes, some really important things that will make a difference to people who are going through the ADP process. But we really do need to be moving on to that fundamental reform of ADP, so it is disappointing that that has been largely parked by the government.
Okay, thanks very much, Craig. Would anyone else like to come in on that? Erica and then Frank, thanks.
Thank you, Mendia Kavina. Thanks very much. Following on from what Craig's saying there, I think one of the first things I wanted to point out is that Scotland has demonstrated the scope of its ambition for disabled people by carrying out such a wide-ranging and inclusive review process. And so we must respect the hard work of disabled people across the country who contributed to the design of the recommendations and who gave their time and explored really sensitive areas in order to really sharpen policy making in this space. So we mustn't lose sight of that, and we must collectively endeavour to ensure that that these recommendations do play a leading role in the development of future social security reform in Scotland. I think there's probably a broad consensus within Scotland now that to realise social security is a genuine investment in disabled people, the eligibility criteria do have to be better able to capture the social conditions in which health conditions are being experienced. We must ensure that the ADP criteria better reflect modern life, and that the impact of social environmental context is, as I say, properly captured. And that's urgent and necessary, and I think it's important that the review has made real progress in understanding how at a practical level we can achieve that. And finally, I would say we need to look towards an approach that considers what the outcome would be for a person if appropriate support were put in place, which widens rather than narrows horizons. And again, the review has taken a lot of steps into how we implement that on a practical basis. And just to finish, I would like to say that we must have absolutely no limits on our ambitions for what we can achieve for disabled people in Scotland and the families and communities in which they live. And social security that is genuinely focused, laser-sharp focus on breaking down barriers for disabled people, can empower them to flourish, to participate fully in social and economic life, and that enriches all of us.
Oh, no, that's really good. Thank you, Erica and Frank. And then, Keith, would you like to come in? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Convener, and I would echo much of what Craig and Erica have said. I think for Enable, this review came in the context of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, their report in 2024, which noted deep concern that adult disability payment wasn't based on human rights, that it wasn't sufficient for people with disabilities in Scotland, and the independent review, which was a comprehensive process, I think gave an opportunity for us to make some of those changes. Adele Harris has made many recommendations that would implement some of those changes, and so while certainly welcoming the recommendations that have been taken on board by Scottish Government, that will certainly help, especially around some elements of accessibility and training and decision-making. But ultimately, the whole review and the response to the review has been overshadowed by financial constraints. And I think that is the perhaps eternal dilemma with social security policy. The best of intentions may be there, but when things are always being looked at through a financial lens rather than the actual outcomes for individuals who are requiring adult disability payment, we're always going to come back, I think, to the same issues. And it is that challenge, it is those best of intentions that social security is an investment in the people of Scotland. I think we, perhaps appropriately in the pre-election period, I think there is certainly a challenge for the next Parliament to truly make that investment, which goes beyond just social security, and perhaps that narrow focus can sometimes bring it back to that financial calculation. That includes investment in social care, it includes investment in employability, it includes investment in community-based support for disabled people and their families. And I think if we have that much broader investment, then we will start to see the returns. That will be reflected in less expenditure in NHS and acute services and other parts of public spending. So I think there is an opportunity to be ambitious, and I think the immediate response from Government to this report has fallen a bit short of that, and we hope that can be rectified.
Okay, thank you, Frank. I'm going to invite Keith in. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with everything that's been said so far by my colleagues in the panel, and MS Society are disappointed with the response of the Scottish Government for many of the reasons that were outlined. Yes, we've got positive changes to processes, guidance, training for staff at Social Security Scotland, and that will improve the experience of people applying for ADP. But fundamentally, we're still using the same eligibility criteria that were introduced when we transferred from DLA to PIP. And those eligibility criteria were introduced to reduce benefit spend by the UK Government. And the UK Government have acknowledged that over time. And that's especially relevant to the mobility component of ADP and PIP, where the UK Government were trying to reduce the benefits bill by £220 billion over a period of time. And there is evidence, and pro bono economics have done some work saying that £1 of benefit spend in disability areas will actually result in £1.48 of economic activity. So actually it enhances the economic activity rather than takes away from that. And also, if we get awards wrong for people living with disabilities and MS, then the cost to society is much, much higher. And again, the MS Society did a report in 2021 that highlighted the fact that, excuse me, I'll just get the actual figures, over a 3-year period of time for the spending review that was focused, it was actually going to cost £96 million additional funding for people living with MS, which is 2% of the people that were actually applying for PIP at that stage. So again, it just highlights the additional costs that are incurred, which won't necessarily be incorporated into some of these calculations. And I believe some of those, I don't know if those calculations have been taken into account with the figure the Scottish Government have put in their response in terms of the £770 million rising to over £1 billion over the period of time that was indicated in the response if we'd adopted some of those changes. And I think Adele Harris said in her written evidence that she would like to see some of those calculations to be able to understand that better. And it's definitely something that I think would add weight to the argument from the Scottish Government for pushing that down the line. But I definitely think we have to consider what those additional costs are. In a different policy area within the Scottish Government, we're looking at long-term conditions and how we can move towards prevention, primary and secondary prevention, and how we manage people living with long-term conditions better. And without some of this additional funding to help meet the additional costs of living with a disability, then that becomes much more challenging for people living with MS and other conditions. Again, because of the cost of living, people with MS are making decisions about whether they pay for food, whether they pay for treatment, or how they actually live their lives, which will have a big impact on how they manage their condition, reduction in independence, and then that will have an ongoing impact on their condition. And again, will increase the requirement to have benefits in other areas to try and meet those costs.
Okay, yeah, there's definitely food for thought in terms of the figures there. They're quite stark, so thanks for that, Keith. So in terms of the Scottish Government's response in terms of the theme on a people's service, do you think that, put that out there, that it creates new work for Social Security Scotland, and how would that look if it does? I don't know if anyone wants to come in.
Yep, Convener. I think the overall view from the Citizens Advice Scotland network is that the People Service recommendations that are being taken forward are highly aligned with current operational practice at Social Security Scotland anyway, which does demonstrate a real commitment to continuous improvement and learning, and we have witnessed that in action. So we do look forward to continuing to build on the strength of that relationship, and I think the planned expansion of an escalation route for advisors, for example, will support increasing communication channels, increasing learning opportunities. And in this spirit, we would urge the opening up of referral pathways from advice agencies to local delivery teams. We're also very interested in becoming involved in collaborative work to embed a trauma-informed approach. I think this is vital. It will improve the experience of victim survivors, for example. And so Citizens Advice Scotland Network looks forward to working with Social Security Scotland on realising plans for an advanced safeguarding team, for example, on the back of that. We do think there's more detail required on some of the recommendations that are being taken forward. So I would point to that it's a bit vague what the vision is for the future role of client experience panels, for instance. So they were set up in 2020. We know they support Social Security Scotland research. But how do they compare, for example, to the lived experience panels that closed in 2024 that were actually involved in the co-design of ADP? We're not sure. So that could be more work on the part of Social Security Scotland to implement that, but we don't know exactly what it looks like. On the consultations point, we feel that prompting people to access their right to choice and control over a consultation from the outset at the earliest possible juncture could actually improve the workload at Social Security Scotland. The reason for that is we think it would help case managers to make person-centred decisions because they'd have more information to hand directly from the individual involved. And it would also ensure, most importantly, that people are provided with the opportunity to discuss their circumstances in full with specialist staff and have their voices properly heard. But my final point would be that we cannot lower our expectations. Training and guidance must be continuously reviewed to ensure that there's no undue weight given to how a person manages pain or whether they're accessing treatment. And the reliability criteria, we've identified lots and lots of problems with how that's being applied. It does need to be applied more rigorously, and we do need to see case law reflected in training. So I suppose in summary what I'm saying there is that this is workload that we might expect Social Security Scotland to have to take on anyway as part of business as usual. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Erica. That's really helpful. I don't know if anyone else would like to come in. Craig?
Yeah, just very briefly, and to echo what Erica says, we welcome the fact the Government have accepted most of the recommendations in this part of the review. On the workload question, that's quite hard, and for the reasons that Erica said, and I don't think implementing those recommendations, many of which are already in the process of being implemented, and in terms of things like the trauma-informed practice, that was already ongoing work, which we strongly welcome, and I don't think will have a workload impact on the agency. And indeed, actually, implementing these and improving the processes will reduce workload potentially, and particularly reduce challenges for clients. So, for example, we welcome very much recommendation 7 around improving promotion of the independent advocacy service. That was something that people fed back to us when we were feeding into the review in terms of my position on the advisory group, but also organisationally feeding into the review that people found great benefit in accessing the independent advocacy service as well as the local delivery teams, but there wasn't huge awareness among individuals themselves or some partners and organisations about that right to advocacy and how to access it. So if we get that right, actually that should probably save time for the agency and, importantly, for people themselves who are engaging with the system.
Okay, no, thanks for that. So, yeah, we've sort of touched upon the recommendations that have came forward and what has actually been implemented or is in the process of being implemented. And then we've got the sort of, the bigger asks in terms of sort of, as you say, the 50% rule and whatnot as well. And again, you touched upon, fluctuation conditions as well. But what do you think in terms of structural reform within those recommendations should be prioritised then? Anyone? No.
So, Convener, do you mean in terms of the Better Future recommendations that have been put on hold?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the key thing here is that these recommendations do reflect the evidence that reorientation of the ADP criteria to better reflect modern life and to capture the social conditions in which disability has been experienced. As I said earlier, that is vital if the payment is to achieve its purpose. How health conditions impact on quality of life and well-being is deeply shaped by factors ranging from the design of social infrastructure, I'm talking workplaces, transport, to the access that an individual person has to social networks and community resources that enable them to manage their health and pursue personal goals. So the recommendations are really designed to try and move us to a point where we develop more of an understanding within the social security system of that. And as I've said before, there must be no limits to our ambition. So I think this should be the beginning and not the end of the conversation. And if I can quickly at this juncture, just to explain just how important some of these very detailed but important changes to the criteria that have been suggested by Adele Harris are. I'll just talk you through the case of a lady that one of our CAB advisors supported within a hospital setting. So Nicole has anorexia. Her weight is still too low for her to be discharged from hospital. But dressing is has a significant relationship to her health because the fit of clothes is very much a proxy for weight gain. Bathing can have a similar impact because of the absolute focus it places on the body. Social engagement is very difficult because of the predominance of food within socialisation in general and interactions in general can quite often revolve around food. She experiences brain fog, she over-exercises, her concentration and focus are affected by her condition. But under the current eligibility criteria, that doesn't fit neatly into the boxes, as it were, of a very narrow functional based criteria. So what we discussed at very great length as part of the review process was how do you get that balance between an objective and a subjective process. And we feel that what the recommendations have done is achieve that balance by essentially widening the scope of the criteria at one level, but on another level narrowing it in the sense that you're sharpening the focus to A, what outcomes could be achieved by putting this support in place, and B, what are the wider impacts of the condition rather than simply a narrow functional approach, which can essentially, it's narrowing how we view what a person needs and what we could achieve for that person if we put the right support in place. So that's where I would say I think is the single most important angle to consider this from. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Erica. I'm now going to invite Carol Mockinnon. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Just again on the review suggested various additions to client communication, but the response emphasised clarity and simplicity. So I just wondered if the witnesses have any thoughts or recommendations on Social Security Scotland currently, whether they're getting that balance right, or is there anything else that we could encourage them to do about information for the clients? So MD Frank, thank you.
Thanks. I think from our perspective, we very much support the focus on simplicity and clarity and conciseness of information. I think that many of the people Enable has supported have commented on how they are bombarded with information. It's on occasion complex language. We do ask for easy-read versions to be available. There is a degree of support with that from Social Security Scotland, but there was also the view that we noted in the government response to the review that a lot of charities and organisations produce their own easy-read materials, and that is something that we are happy to do, but in many cases we do it when there's a gap. So if there's a gap from a government agency, we have to step in and produce easy-read materials for the benefit of people who would require that. So I think certainly that focus on simplicity and clarity and conciseness is positive. I also noted recommendation 17 from Adele Harris, which related to having essentially all the information collated in a single source, so that people don't essentially have to run a small business to keep files of all the letters that they've had from Social Security Scotland and cross-reference what letter did they get 6 months ago and what did that say. So the government I think put that on the back burner in terms of whether they would take it forward. We would encourage that because I think when people, again, they're not necessarily experienced with this amount of contact with government agencies, I think to have that clarity in a single place of these are all the pieces of relevant information, and I don't think that is in conflict with that focus on simplicity. Having everything in one place does keep it simple. So I think there's maybe simplicity doesn't necessarily mean shorter or less information. I think it means the simplicity of having that in a single source where you can review everything to do with your case without having to cross-reference it in a number of places. And I think the further element, I don't know if it's another question we're going to be asked, was the idea of an online portal. I think if there was that opportunity for people to keep people who are comfortable using technology and using mobile phone apps or whatever the portal would be from, that would also reduce the workload of Social Security Scotland because people would be less inclined to follow up or chase up what's going on with their cases. So I think there are definitely communication advances that could be made, and we hope that is something. I know government didn't rule it out, it's not something they're doing immediately, but I think it is something that we would encourage on both counts.
And that easier flow might just help so many clients. Can I just ask, you brought up a really important point about the easy to read, easy to use guidance. Do we know, is there anywhere that you've seen that we know that staff are trained in how you might approach that or might make use of those guidances? Have you seen anything on that?
I'm not sure exactly where they do get training. There are organisations that provide that.
Yeah.
So I would have to check if Social Security Scotland is using any of those sources to train staff, but it's definitely something we would encourage.
Yeah, it's something we could maybe look at as well. Is it, I don't know if anybody else wants to come in.
Just come in briefly there, Carol. Just to say that, well, our focus tends to be on telephony and for example, when you contact Social Security Scotland, they do deliver 15 payments, but it's one switchboard line. Yeah. So we do focus on that, and getting text messages rolled out was a really brilliant progress. But as far as the online service goes, I think one of the difficulties that our clients experience is that you have to establish a mygov.scot account first. And that can be quite difficult for people if you've got limited digital access or literacy, or you've maybe set up an email address in the past and you can't remember your password. And everything has to be re-established. And there's also an extent to which some people are not always necessarily comfortable with going through a central government portal like that. They would find it easier to upload things on a sort of standalone digital portal, I think, for a lot of people. But I would also say that Social Security Scotland is very good at being proactive in terms of having an evolving strategy that's able to respond to developments around inclusive communication and things that would make it better. I think finally, if I could direct members towards the form, which is something that we always think could be a subject of continuous improvement. We've been really impressed at recent improvements Social Security Scotland have proposed to the redetermination notice. And in a similar spirit, with the application form itself, I think what would work best would be to have a real focus on the framing of the form in a way that facilitates free and full responses and encourages people to use the free text spaces. We know from Social Security Scotland's research that decision makers find more open questions, generate answers that are easier to make person-centred decisions on the basis of. So I just wanted to kind of direct members to that. I think we always have to bear in mind that this is a process that can be extremely overwhelming for people. We are asking people to consider the most difficult parts of their lives, the most sensitive parts of their lives, to confront things that they don't normally have to confront in everyday life. And we do just have to make it as easy as possible for people to open up about those things in a helpful way. There are so many things that people will take for granted, and the form should be able to gently, not intrusively, prompt them to speak about these things as openly and freely as possible.
Just to be clear, so that I can think about it, so you're saying that it is helpful for people to have free text boxes so that they can maybe write in their own words how they present? Yeah.
Absolutely. And especially there's so many people, of course, that will be involved in applying for adult disability payment who maybe do have communication barriers or find it really, really difficult to articulate their circumstances in writing. And when they step through the door of an advice agency like ours, and it's a very humanising experience, it's very non-judgmental, and they can then speak quite freely, and the impact on their self-worth and self-respect, and it just makes it easier for an advisor, for example, to capture that. So it comes from all angles. It's not just making it easier for the individual to put those free-flowing answers in, but also for advice agencies and other support workers who are helping that person to make sure they get the most out of the form.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you. I'm now going to invite Claire Baker in. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. It's now moving on to the theme 2 of processes that work. So while the Government accepted a number of recommendations, there were some that they weren't going to recommend that have been rejected. And the first one I wanted to ask about was redetermination of the whole award. Now, the recommendation was that it should only be the area that's been challenged that would be investigated, but the Government have disagreed. And the explanation they've given us in that it's best achieved by maintaining the current process. So the commitment to robust, accurate decision-making is best achieved by maintaining the current process. I don't know if anyone wants to kind of respond to that and maybe flesh out why you think the Government have decided to stick to the process that is rather than follow the recommendation. I don't know, Erica, do you want to come?
I'm happy to come in on that. I can understand. I think Cast Network understands the position of the Scottish Government on this, because there genuinely is a risk that people may not get everything that they're entitled to if there's a narrow focus on one particular activity or even one particular descriptor in some cases. But what we do see is the risk on the opposite side of things as well, that when an entire award is redetermined, that can lead to unexpected and surprising outcomes that can cause a lot of distress, confusion for people. So what I would say in relation to the response here is that what this means is that we must be even more focused on improving decision-making. And when it comes to decision-making at the redetermination stage, what we have seen is significant levels of inconsistency at points in time. And so I would just reiterate that we need to make sure training and guidance is reviewed regularly, and that the reliability criteria in particular are robustly applied. We do see a link there between how the reliability criteria are being utilised and some inconsistencies in decision-making. And again, to make sure that case law is reflected in guidance, there's been some really significant pieces of case law at both PIP level and ADP level that, once they are fully implemented within guidance and training, etc., should make a significant difference. We recognise that there is a balance between subjectivity and objectivity in all ADP decision-making, so there is always going to be a degree of, in that sense, volatility. And we also recognise that, of course, it's a brand new decision-maker and a brand new process at redetermination stage, so there will be differences between outcomes even that have already been decided in favour of the individual initial application. All of that is likely to be, to a certain extent, part of the system, but as long as everybody understands how it operates and that they are going to get a fair decision based on a set of guidance that everyone can refer to understand how that decision is likely to be made, what the process behind and the thinking behind how a case manager will come to that decision is. Thanks, Peter.
So you recognise the problem there is, but there is another solution that is about making decisions better rather than kind of unpacking it. And then another area was around the short-term assistance. The recommendation is that should be an opt-out rather than opt-in. Now, I was wondering if get views on that, but also do we know? So it seems like that payment. I was wondering if we know how many people claim it, and is it recognised as to being an underused payment? Because if we're looking at opt-in, that would suggest there's maybe underutilisation of it or lack of awareness of it, or I don't know if who wants to come back on that. Erica, if you want
Me
to
again, sorry. Yeah, I mean, we've seen a significant increase, about a threefold increase in the last year in the number of people seeking our advice about short-term assistance. But I would still point out that awareness and understanding is low. One of the issues that both CPAG and ourselves have begun to see is that short-term assistance is not a qualifying payment for carer support payment or carers element on universal credit. So there does need to be a bit more, I suppose, communication around short-term assistance, and that would be the concern that if there was an opt-out rather than opt-in, there's maybe perhaps less opportunity to communicate to people exactly what short-term assistance means. So I would stress that side of it, the communication piece and the raising awareness piece. People must be able to exercise choice and control, and I think opting in can do that if we focus on making sure that that choice is meaningful by communicating effectively with people about short-term assistance.
And I don't know if anybody else, Craig, do you want to come in?
Just kind of briefly, and I absolutely agree with what Erica was saying. I mean, I suppose kind of stepping back, we believe short-term assistance has been one of the really big positives and big improvements in terms of the development of the Scottish social security system, as with actually moving to a system of redeterminations rather than reconsiderations. I think having a new case manager looking at the case is positive in the round. On short-term assistance, I mean, our position is I think we would favour an opt-out system. I'm a wee bit confused by the government's rationale and their response that would reduce flexibility. By opting out, you still have the choice to opt out, so you still have flexibility. But as Erica says, that would definitely need to be alongside clear and proper communication about the impact of short-term assistance on other benefits, including the interaction of the reserved system. So, yes, I mean, very much in favour of the recommendation from the review, and just a tad confused about the government's position that to be opt-out would reduce flexibility.
Yeah. So what you're saying though, is that short-term assistance could have an impact. If you receive that, has an impact on other benefits you're receiving from.
I'm just kind of just to echo Erica's point, just as it's not a gateway to others, that just needs to be clearly communicated to clients. But I mean, our position on short-term assistance is it's been hugely positive. It provides good financial stability and reassurance for people when they're going through that mandatory redetermination process and when they're challenging awards, and it's been overall a big positive, so we'd be strongly in favour of it being.
Do you know how long somebody would get short-term assistance for? Typically, how long the process takes? Or?
Until the redetermination is completed and decided.
Do we know roughly how long that takes to go through a redetermination, or is there no kind of do we know, like how long an appeal or a redetermination takes? How long that's?
Well, the statute limits on redetermination is 56 days.
56,
yes, and I think that's broadly being met. There has been some changes over time in terms of how many people are met, redeterminations are met within that time frame. Some people do wait longer. I don't have the timescales for appeals in my head or to hand, but yeah, 56 days is the kind of legal statutory maximum for redetermination.
Okay. Well, the committee has been taking evidence from Social Security Scotland on their communication strategy and how we can improve uptake of certain benefits, so that's helpful. Thank you. Unless anybody else wants to come in, we'll move to the next. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. I'm now going to invite Marie McNair in.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Thanks for your time. The Scottish Government is unable to commit to an online portal to track the progress of applications. Do you feel that the online portal is a priority for the people that you do support. I'll start off with Craig, if you're okay to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think an online portal would be helpful. I think we're kind of understanding of the government's position about why it can't commit to that at the moment. The only caveat I would put around that is choice is hugely important, and we know digital exclusion is an issue, particularly for some people living with mental health problems. So we wouldn't want to see a move to a digital by default model in terms of how people can access and manage their interaction with Social Security Scotland. But yes, I think there would be benefit in an online portal for that simplicity for a large number of people, but it should be one option among kind of many in terms of how people engage with the system.
Thanks, Craig. Anybody else? Keith?
I'll just mirror what Craig's saying. Is I think it's important, again, as Frank touched on earlier, having that repository where all your information is there that you can access quite quickly and easily is a really important stage, because it simplifies what people have to go through. And as we've mentioned already, I think it can be quite a stressful process. And for people with MS, quite a lot of people experience fatigue, so it's something they have to drop in and out of and do whenever they're feeling as if they're actually at their best. They have cognitive issues, so being able to track that and have everything in one place is a positive. But again, just as Craig says, I can understand potentially why that's not been implemented at this stage, but I think it's one option that should be explored. And similarly, again, say on a similar note, linking up the local delivery network, telephone link and the referral process, I think something that's really important, because that's a positive step that everybody that we've spoken to with MS who's went through that process has found hugely beneficial. So rather than having to go through Social Security Scotland to make that application, then we should be simplifying that process. And there's a period of continuous improvement, which again, it seems to be what Social Security Scotland and Scottish Government want. That's a huge step that we have to be trying to look at and implement as soon as we possibly can.
Yeah, I think it is really important that people should be able to keep track of their application. I think that's something that we need to push forward to whoever gets elected in the next government going forward. The Scottish Government have agreed to review the ADP application form, and the response points to the current form being a kind of result of years of engagement with stakeholders. What lessons from previous work can we inform the next review? Frank?
I think from my perspective, and I think as you've noted, as the Government has also noted, there has been that great level of stakeholder input. I think it's probably the quality of engagement is critical there. I think perhaps there's a risk sometimes that there can be almost engagement for the sake of engagement when there hasn't necessarily been a focus on having the skills and experience in the room for some of those discussions that have a lot of broader experience of working on these sorts of forms, of seeing the outcomes, perhaps working in a social security agency previously and understanding what happens as these come through. So I think that sometimes there isn't necessarily the right experience being consulted on these. I think is perhaps a risk that there is at times. So I think that we do need to make sure that that engagement is broader and is bringing in that expertise from all angles of that experience. We absolutely encourage the lived experience focus that there is, but there's also an element of caution that people with lived experience of applying for benefits don't necessarily have the same experience of what's going to happen when the form arrives with an assessor. So I think we do need to make sure there's that broader experience is brought into that process to hopefully get it right first time. So I did detect an element of frustration perhaps in the Government's response to that they felt that a lot of work had already been done on that, but that would be my view as to how that could be improved this time.
Thank you. Keith?
I would add to that and say, I think it's disappointing that the Scottish Government aren't willing to take that forward, because one of the big piece of feedback we got during the consultation period for the independent review was that some people seen that the application form as a barrier because of its length, because of the way it's set out, the complexity of actually trying to fill it in. So people saying the length of the form, it looks complicated, puts people off applying, and anything that's put in place as a barrier has to be a negative. So we have to look at how we can improve that. Taking it forward, people are saying there wasn't enough space to explain how their condition impacts them day to day and how their symptoms impact on the actual eligibility criteria as effectively as possible. So if they're not managing to express the impact that their condition has on their ability to perform the tasks, the assessor's not going to be able to take that into consideration when they're actually making a decision about what award they should be getting. So we have to look at that again, and we have to make sure that we get the application form as good as it possibly can be. But I would go back to my original point that if we change the eligibility criteria to actually be able to allow people to reflect the holistic person-centred approach we want to take for this. That should improve things moving forward. But in the meantime, we have to review the application form to give people the opportunity to fully express how their conditions impacting on their life day to day.
You feel that kind of application process is deterring folk from claiming for benefits? Yeah. Definitely. And we're speaking earlier on there about, you know, the sort of benefit take-up. You know, we were sort of dealing with Job Start payments last week, and obviously, you know, about the stigma, you know, attached to claiming. Are you kind of able to kind of comment on the impact that associated stigma is having on benefit take-up across the board?
Not overly, I'll be honest. We're not, don't give benefits advice as such. We tend to go out and just ask for advice and consult with our membership and people living with MS about specific issues. So I wouldn't be able to comment on that as effectively as potentially others in the panel who provide that support. But yes, I think there is definitely a stigma there. There's stigma associated with living with a long-term condition generally. And I think a big part of that especially is around how people are perceived in terms of invisible symptoms. And that's a huge part of MS. I think people with invisible symptoms feel judged quite considerably, especially if they're engaging with somebody who makes it clear they're experiencing their own benefits. Again, the example I can give straight away that just pops into my head is I know of a gentleman who was their dentist, and the dentist highlighted the fact that they're on benefits and just felt that everybody in the waiting room was turning around to look at him because physically he didn't look as if there was anything wrong with him. However, he's been living with MS for a long period of time, so that stigma is there. And having to be able to go through that in those situations just shouldn't happen, and it is a stigma that's definitely still persists.
It's something that I raised at CAB's East Dunbartonshire AGM the other week there about stigma and about benefit take-up and promotion of it. If you get any thoughts that you want to kind of add in as well that might help the committee?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a really significant and sometimes spoken about issue, and particularly with the narrative around media around welfare reform, as though people were being talked above, as it were, and the way sometimes it's framed as, rather than being an investment in people that can provide people with the tools they need to fully participate in social and economic life, there's a sense to which some of the narrative is about it being a burden on the public purse, and that's something that we really need to redirect, because in fact, the cost of inaction, the cost of not providing this type of support is far higher than the cost of providing it, potentially. What we also see in small rural communities where people tend to know each other's businesses, we tend to find that can be a real deterrent to looking at social security as well. And talking about invisible and fluctuating conditions, people do feel a sense in which they have to justify themselves to a greater extent, to prove it, have to justify that I need the help, and that's just it's a really unacceptable situation, I think, for a compassionate society that is seeking to treat people experiencing ill health and disability with dignity and respect.
Certainly that culture, certainly in the west of Scotland, you know, I do need it, but somebody else needs it more than me, so
yeah,
it's trying to kind of break through that. Sorry, Craig.
Just to comment briefly on the stigma, and I don't have data on me, but anecdotally we hear from people that we support over many years that dual impact of stigma in terms of stigma about accessing social security in the first place, and that being a real barrier, as well as compounded by the stigma of living with mental illness, and particularly kind of to what Keith and Erica were saying around the invisible nature of that at points, and having to justify yourself and kind of prove that you're unwell. And I would reflect that I think the review has come at a timely point, and we've been very disappointed about some of the media and political discourse that over the past couple of years, particularly in terms of social security, relating to very much framing it as a cost rather than an investment, as Erica has said, but particularly in the way that mental health and young people around mental health has been spoken about in terms of social security, almost singling this group out in terms of being undeserving or not disabled enough and not worthy of social security, where we know the impact of living with a mental health condition can be entirely profound and life-changing and have had a huge impact on your daily living, on your mobility, and being able to live an independent and full life. And that social security and ADP is absolutely essential for many people living with mental health problems. I mean, we know in terms of ADP caseload that roughly 40% of people in receipt of ADP, a mental health condition is their primary condition. That can be slightly misleading because actually most people applying for ADP will have multiple conditions. But yeah, I think it would be not right for me not to put on record our real disappointment at the way that some of the debate around social security and social security reform, both at the Westminster but also at the Scottish level now, has been handled in terms of the way that people living with mental health problems have been kind of disbelieved and spoken about. Huge discourse around over-medicalisation, over-diagnosis, which has very little evidence base to it at all. And we're talking about people's real lives and how essential actually access to social security is for them, not just to live independent lives, but for many people to actually access employment. And that conflation of ADP, which is a non-income related benefit, with income-related benefits is also incredibly frustrating. But we know ADP does have a role in supporting people to stay in work when they have mental health problems, as well as it should be doing, helping people live dignified, independent lives as part of the community.
Yeah, I do share your concerns, and I'm constantly calling out, and I think as MSPs we really need to be mindful of the language that we do use. Do you mean? The human beings at the end of the day, absolutely, and we're only one pay slip away from needing it ourselves. So, thanks, Chair.
No, thanks very much, Marie. I'm now going to invite Alexander Stewart in. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. It's very apparent that organisations like yourselves and charities are very disappointed that the Scottish Government has not addressed many of the substantive system changes and recommendations that the review proposed. So it would be good to get a view from you of the lack of that response. So, the Scottish Government has not provided a response to most of the recommendations on the changing eligibility. What is your view on that? And are you just disappointed, or do you have more to say on that? And if maybe go to Craig and then Frank.
As I said earlier, we're fundamentally, without the change to the underlying structures of ADP, we're not going to move to a system which is really in living out the principles of the Scottish social security system, in terms of social security being an investment in the people of Scotland and a human right in itself, and helping people realise their human rights, including independent living. So for us, we are disappointed. We think the kind of key recommendations in the review for us were around abolishing the 50% rule in terms of eligibility. We know, particularly for people living with mental health problems or other fluctuating conditions, being able to quantify that impact on their daily living or mobility in terms of kind of 50% of the time we're impacted, 50% we're not, is really challenging. And we really should be moving towards a more holistic view, looking at the impact on people's whole life in terms of disability and, in particular, for my case, mental health problems. We do recognise that there are challenges in that, in terms of we need to balance that subjectivity and objective decision-making. But the 50% rule, we think, is a huge barrier in terms of people fluctuating conditions. And very much as well, the recommendations in the review around looking at the recommendation 41, which was kind of to review eligibility and decision-making, and then those recommendations which looked at some of the daily living activities, we think were really important in terms of better incorporating psychological distress and the impact of people's mental health in terms of some of those daily living activities, which at the moment people kind of tell us is very challenging from a mental health perspective, in terms of being able to quantify that in how the benefit is structured at the moment in terms of the impact on people's daily living kind of functions. And fundamentally, we've long called for that move away from a system that's based on kind of discrete functionality to kind of test the functionality, to one that is looking at that broader impact of disability on people's lives and the outcomes for them as well from taking activities. So for us, there was hugely positive recommendations in the review in terms of shifting to a model, looking at someone more in the round, looking at the impact of activities rather just the ability to do an individual activity on a one-off basis, much greater focus on the reliability criteria instead of the 50% rule. So yes, we're hugely disappointed that they haven't been taken forward, and we think really if we want to impact the experience of people's day-to-day lives in terms of their engagement with ADP and how ADP can support people, we really do need to change those underlying structures of the benefit in terms of eligibility and decision-making. While, as I said at the start, process changes will be welcome and will make some impact, fundamentally we're not going to have real positive change unless we look at the benefits structures.
And is that the same for Enable, Frank? Do you believe that its service users are not going to progress to the level or to be seen what is required?
Yes, we would agree with that, and I think it does need that review of how assessments are conducted in the eligibility, which Adele has recommended in her review. We are frustrated that's not being taken on, and I think the reason it's not being taken on is fairly straightforwardly related to cost. I think there's a broad understanding, and again, as I'd referenced, the UN committee had highlighted that the system that we use in Scotland is not human rights based. I think an ambitious move to a human rights based model, which again Adele's recommendations are moving us towards that, if they were taken on board, would start to address that. We can't ignore the cost issue. We can't be unrealistic about that. I know the Scottish Fiscal Commission referencing the existing gap and the growing gap, and with Social Security taking, I think, 14% now of the Scottish resource budget. We are cognizant of that issue, and that obviously government has to think about that, but it does have to be a much broader and perhaps braver approach to investing in society. As I'd alluded to earlier, precisely the same issues, frankly, around eligibility criteria are being experienced by people in terms of social care. We are seeing local authorities and health and social care partnerships narrowing their criteria, cutting people's awards, having a very real impact on people's lives, their ability to be out and about and engaged in their community, which again has negative knock-ons to their health, which again increases a burden for the NHS and other services in the community and social work and other acute services. So we do seem to be getting things a little bit back to front, that we are afraid to spend and invest in what we know is the right thing to do when it comes to social security or to social care. And perhaps it is that braver, longer-term objective, and maybe, as I'd said, perhaps heading into a new Parliament is a good time to be a bit more braver and long-term about some of these decisions, because I think we do need to change our approach. And as we said, we recognise there are costs involved. We recognise, of course, Parliament and Government must have those considerations uppermost in their mind, but we will make savings longer term if we have the bravery to make that investment now. So that was perhaps our biggest disappointment, but there is an opportunity in the next Parliament to have that much more holistic approach to investing in society.
Anything from you, Erica?
Alexander, if I could just reiterate the point that the cost of inaction and poverty evasion is grave. I mean, the cost will be felt in our health services, by our crisis support systems, by our advice services, in levels of public debt in our communities, and of course in inadequately realised human potential, which is really what we're talking about here. I think the sort of direction of travel that the review would take us in, it would help us to unpick the societal, structural and personal influences on someone's health, and that could improve our sort of collective understanding and ability to break down barriers. So I think that's the missed opportunity, and I think it's widely recognised that a focus on that broader context and also on outcomes, the outcomes of providing this type of support and how we capture that in the assessment process, is the way forward. But I would also say that there was a lot of tidying up exercises in the review that I think could have been done now. So while I recognise the cost point, and I'll go on to talk about devolution in a second, some of the things, like for example, one of the descriptors has under the support with treatment only has 1 point allocated to it, even though it's exactly the same functional restrictions as in all of the other activities. There was other tidying up exercises like that throughout, and I think on the 20-metre rule, which Keith will speak more eloquently than I can about, our advisors just do not understand that criteria. It doesn't seem to be in line with other public policy matters, so I would refer to bear with me, it's a handbook, the Building Standards Handbook, Technical Handbook for Non-Domestic Buildings, which states that accessible car parking should be within 45 metres of the entrance to a building. But if you're suggesting that in order to get an enhanced rate to get a mobility vehicle, you can only walk to things like that. So I do think we have to take a more joined-up approach to some of the recommendations. And indeed, in that very handbook, it acknowledges that gradients, weather conditions, handrails and other factors will obviously affect the distances and ability of a person to walk. So finally, I would point out on the devolution point, I'll come back to that. What I think we do need to do is ensure that ADP continues to contribute to financial stability for disabled people in Scotland and works in harmony with the reserved social security system. And I think that's a big part of what's held the Scottish Government back on some of the bigger changes that we're looking to make. But that doesn't mean we can compromise on a commitment to empowering disabled people in Scotland through a social security system rooted in dignity, fairness and respect. So we have to consider those two things at once. And so my final point here would be that while it's not yet clear how reform to the reserved social security system will unfold, the work being undertaken to develop the proposals at Westminster level does afford a potential opportunity to advance the review's recommendations. The review has explored in detail a lot of the ground that is being explored currently at Westminster level, so I think there's a real opportunity to seize that moment and encourage a broader UK direction along the lines of what the review's recommended. Thanks, Lisanne.
My next question, probably, Frank.
Sorry, can I just come in? There's
Yes, sure.
just a slight confusion with the questions. So I believe that was Jeremy was keen to come in on theme 4.
Sorry, it's my fault then. I maybe done it then. Okay, sorry.
Okay, carry on,
Thank
Alexander.
You've touched on the 50% rule, and that's caused some disquiet for everybody in the process. So maybe, Frank, if you can give us an idea of what you thought of the process within reference to that, and do you think that the government have, by not tackling and doing the impact, do witnesses believe that debate has moved forward, and has it actually got any better because of the way that it has been moved, and it's been deferred and discussed on many times, but it hasn't actually progressed any further forward? And sorry, I noticed that I've done that.
So, thank you.
Yeah, I think from our perspective on that, there is that disappointment there. I think the flaws in the 50% rule, 20-metre rule, many of these elements are well established, and I think, frankly, they remain in place because of savings. Effectively, if we have those in place, it is easier to set a bar for people that is controlling costs and controlling spending in that respect. So I think we would certainly have preferred that, as has been outlined by other witnesses, that human rights focus on those assessments of people. I think for people with a learning disability in particular, there's a number of the points, elements of it that are perhaps not necessarily allowing them to demonstrate where their need actually lies. I think the one that is referenced in the report particularly is around reading, where someone may be able to read but is not necessarily comprehending, and we've not really got the best way to assess that at the present time. So I think there's a number of things which the recommendations were strong on, and there is a bit of a frustration that we are stalled on that. I think it is, again, it's that theme where I think the government gets that this isn't okay and it needs to change, but they don't seem willing to make the bigger steps to make those changes, and that's certainly something we would like to see taken forward in the next Parliament.
Can I come in? I'd pick up on what Frank says, and it's definitely something that we are disappointed in as an organisation that represents people who are living with a fluctuating condition. And the example I'll give, which I think is probably overly simplistic, but I think the 50% rule is overly simplistic in itself, is that somebody who, with MS, might be able to walk 20 metres on 60% of the days. But what happens for the other 40%? Are they using a wheelchair for the other 40% of the time? Are they staying in the house, sitting in a chair, or just back and forward to bed within that 40% time? It doesn't necessarily reflect true life and doesn't actually take into consideration the impact of all the other activities have on whether or not you can walk 20 metres. If you were to ask somebody with MS whether they can walk 20 metres 50% of the time, the vast majority of them would think, yeah, I can, because they can do it. But it doesn't. They don't then consider that in the round and the holistic impact of how that is on their day-to-day life. ADPs, a disability assistance benefit, to meet the additional costs of living with a disability. in quite a lot of cases, people are incurring those costs regardless of whether they're experiencing those symptoms one day a week or 7 days a week. They're still having to meet those additional costs. Therefore, having something in place that actually punishes people who are not experiencing the symptom as much while they're still meeting those costs isn't fair in that regard either. So I think the 50% is still overly simplistic.
Okay. If I could just, if you don't mind, just quickly add to that, because you can really see these issues in the data itself. I mean, on the mobility point, for example, there's only 6% of mobility-only awards that have been granted across Scotland, whereas there's 43% daily living awards only across Scotland. And some of that does reflect the fact that people often better understand how a mobility need impacts on a daily living capacity. They understand that better than they perhaps understand how the conditions that impact daily living also impact on their mobility. But when it comes to the data around fluctuating conditions, so although mental and behavioural disorders, mental health and behavioural disorders make up around 40% of the total caseload, 44% of recipients in this category score less than 4 points in all of the 10 activities. The second most common category of the caseload is diseases of the musculoskeletal system and connective tissue, and they have only 20% of the caseload, but they have the highest proportion, scoring less than 4 points in all activities, and they're more likely to score less than 4 points in all activities regardless of whether they're receiving a standard or an enhanced rate. So what this data is telling us is that invisible fluctuating conditions are less likely to be scoring more points, they're less likely to have higher awards. And we can see this also in the award refusal rate as well, if you really look at in a bit of depth at the data. So I just kind of wanted to highlight that quickly. Thanks, Alexander.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Convener.
That's perfectly fine. Okay, thanks very much. I am now going to invite Jeremy Balfour in. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Just again, to put on record, I am on receipt of a high rate of ADP. Can I also thank both of you for coming, not only today, but you represent the third sector who have been here for the last 5 years giving evidence, and I know as a committee we appreciate your time and effort that you have put in over the last number of years. I wonder if I can go on to two questions. The first one is firstly, and Erica, you picked up on this, we've obviously got a PIP review happening at the UK level, and we don't know how that will work out in the autumn and where the government will do. I suppose, more philosophically, can we have a system where you have different criteria north and south of the border? Because obviously it impacts on other benefits, can impact on how people do it. Can you envisage a system where you would stay with the 50% rule in England and that was got rid of in Scotland? Can that work philosophically?
I'll jump in first. I mean, philosophically, I think Scotland should be an exemplar of good practice and moving to a truly rights-based approach to social security. I think the issue is more practical than philosophical in terms of we have devolution for a reason, and we have devolved social security for a reason, and we should be able to make full use of those powers to ensure that we have a system which fully works for disabled people in Scotland and helps them achieve and realise their human rights. My concern for many years has been the barriers placed on more fundamental reform, which is reflected in the Scottish Government's response in terms of the impact that has on the reserved system. And I think that particularly around the equivalency aspect of will ADP remain to be equivalent for PIP and how that impacts access to reserve benefits. So universal credit health element, we would absolutely not want to lose automatic access to that for people in receipt of ADP, and the impact on passported benefits, so benefits that people can receive because they are in receipt of ADP, but they can receive some reserved aspects of the reserve system, benefits of the reserve system. And I think my plea is to kind of both governments, they really need to get to a clear position on that, because understandably when the social security system was first being developed in Scotland and powers were being devolved and ADP was originally getting set up, and I think we all agreed in safe and secure transfer and the need to have that really close kind of legal alignment between PIP and ADP in terms of legal foundations. But that was always based on the premise and promise that we would be able to have more fundamental reform in the future, or it really defeats the purpose of devolving it in the first place. That's not to say these issues aren't tricky and in terms of passporting and equivalency, but they can't be forevermore a permanent barrier to reform in Scotland. So, I mean, we have been calling for a long, as we've said many times, kind of across this session, for that fundamental reform of the overall structures of ADP so it works better for people, disabled people and people living with mental health problems. And we need to kind of be brave and start doing that and test the limits in terms of equivalency between ADP and PIP, and to find workable solutions about where actually we can move apart but not lose those important linkages to the reserved system. So it's really tricky, and it's kind of, I suppose, frustrating that it's something that's spoken about a lot and has been for years, but there's been no kind of progress in terms of actually bottoming that out and coming to a position about, well, what is the true limits in terms of reform in the Scottish system.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly add to that, because I'll just echo absolutely everything that you just said there, Craig, and I think that this is a moment to be bold and brave, as Craig said, and to be leading in this field. We've already I suppose, proven the concept and the value of building a social security system on a set of principles and rooting it in a set of principles, introducing a charter that helps people understand what to expect based on those principles. And that has in itself been a tremendously valuable thing and has made a real material, tangible difference to how the system operates and the impact it therefore has on the disabled people interacting with it. But the practical barriers are undeniable, and this is why, as Craig says, we have to test the limits and find what those limits are, but we also at the same time have to be trying to lead and influence the direction of the Scottish Government. The overlap between the reserved and devolved system is so intense. I mean, for example, about 44% of the people that we see who are getting advice about ADP and other things are also getting advice about universal credit. So the overlap is so significant that it can't be ignored. But this is why we have to be, bold, brave and leading.
Yeah. Again, I reiterate everything that Erica and Craig have said, but what I would add to that is I feel the delay in publishing the response is a real frustration, because it feels like a missed opportunity to actually set that agenda. So the UK Government were setting up the Timms review to look at what PIP was going to do, and it just feels that within that time, the Scottish Government could have a better response to this. The independent review set out its plans of what it would like to do, look at what it was planning to do with eligibility criteria in more detail, and grasp the bull by the horns and take that forward whilst there was that state of flux in the UK system. And then, as Craig said, I think it's much more a practical issue rather than a philosophical issue of having those conversations and discussions between the two governments of how to make it work, rather than say, let's just leave it as it is because it's going to be challenging and difficult. I think for people living with MS and disabled people who are claiming the benefits, we need to make this work and actually have it as a true investment in society. And I think by delaying so much, we've missed that opportunity to actually set the agenda.
Okay, let me finish with a positive question. So it's the 8th of May. We have a new government in place. The new Secretary, Cabinet Secretary for Social Security comes to you and says, here's my magic wand. You can have one of the things that's in the report, and I'll grant it for you today. Which of everything in the report is the one thing? I know what Keith's going to say, but for the rest of you, what is the one thing that you would choose as the one thing that would make the biggest difference to the people that you're trying to help? I'll go for Keith first, because he's got the easy one to answer.
Thanks, Jeremy. I would change the eligibility criteria of the mobility component and review the 20-metre rule.
And what would you go to? Because obviously I'm old enough, probably a bit like you, Keith, sorry to be rude, but we remember the 100-metre rule. So I remember it used to be, could you walk the football pitch was the test. Would you go back to that, or would you not put a figure on it?
I wouldn't put an arbitrary distance on it because it's such a complex skill that involves sensory motor issues. Being able to walk a certain distance does not fully explain your need for mobility support. So I don't have the answer, Jeremy. My brain's not big enough to comprehend that, but I would look to see how we can assess something and how people move around holistically. If that's in a crowded space, if it's on uneven ground, if it's carrying shopping bags, etc. but looking at that in the round and doing a person-centred approach rather than it being an arbitrary distance, because the arbitrary distance doesn't tell you the full story. So,
okay, Craig, your magic wand's over to you.
I mean, if I was going to, the biggest change, and kind of looking back at the recommendations from the review, would be fully implement recommendation 41 and 42, so that we get rid of the 50% rule. But as Kiefer said, looking at the eligibility criteria and fundamentally reforming the eligibility criteria, so it's rooted in, if we are going to stick with a points-based system, maybe that would be my one, to get rid of a points-based system. We would have actually liked to have gone further than the review. But if we are going to stick in that with a points-based system, rooting those descriptors in everyday life, looking at the impact of undertaking those activities and descriptors, not just how you can actually do it there and then, particularly ensuring that the descriptors reflect the impact on people's mental health and psychological distress for undertaking daily living activities, and moving away from a deficit-based model of examining functionality to one that is rooted in people's individual experience and how they actually interact in society on a day-to-day basis. So yes, eligibility criteria is the absolute one, but you can't do that without getting rid of the 50% rule.
Okay.
I'm going to cheat slightly by
that's okay, so it's Craig, so.
which is to echo Craig's emphasis on eradicating the 50% rule, because I think one of the knock-on effects of that would be that it would kind of force, in a sense, a robust application of the reliability criteria, because you wouldn't have the 50% rule to fall back on. So it would automatically, I think, improve decision-making in terms of making being person-centred. Linked to this is why I'm saying I'm cheating slightly, is I would advocate for, I think from memory it's recommendation 47, but that is from memory, so it may be wrong, is the substantial risk criteria. This is something that the CAST network has particularly good evidence would make a real difference. And what it would introduce is something that would work quite well in harmony with proposals at the UK government level to look to a future without the work capability assessment, for instance. So what the substantial risk criteria would do is it would look at the model or the precedent set by the substantial risk criteria within the Universal Credit Work Capability Assessment to ensure that decision makers looking at a set of circumstances, a person in a particularly vulnerable situation, and make a decision that while they don't fit neatly into the functional criteria boxes, so sufficient points can't be awarded, there is a real and substantial risk if this financial support were not put in place. And I'm referring to things like social isolation, for example, quite extreme social isolation, self-harm, these kinds of risks. Having that channel for decision makers to transcend the functional criteria, but in a way that is narrow and limited enough to be subjective, I think could make a real transformative difference, in spite of the fact that the numbers would likely to be low. So that would be my key wish list ask.
And last but not least, Frank.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I think that the top priority would be around the eligibility criteria, but so as not to repeat that, the other one I would focus on is around redeterminations and appeals and some of those elements of it. I think it was one of the long-standing criticisms of the DWP model over the last 15 years was a feeling that people were almost discouraged from applying. They were discouraged from challenging decisions that they disagreed with. The mandatory reconsideration process, excuse me, when they changed it to they changed the names of it. I forgot what it used to be called. So the mandatory reconsideration process for PIP, there was, very few of those would actually result in an improved award. There was a suspicion that it wasn't really being reconsidered at that stage and that people had to go to appeal, and when they did, more than two-thirds were successful. So I think that was a major thing that we wanted to change with Social Security Scotland. When we moved to redeterminations, we're still in a situation where about half of them do result in an improved award. That is better. That does mean it's at least happening, but it is our concern where the full award may be reconsidered at that stage. That is off-putting to people. People see that your award may go down as well as up, and a lot of people who perhaps should be requesting that redetermination are put off doing so. Similarly, more than half of the appeals are still being successful. So I think there is still an issue there where perhaps there is something going wrong in the initial decisions that we need to get better. And I think if those reforms that are proposed around the form and around decision making can be brought forward, then I think that would definitely be positive. So I think, as well as the eligibility criteria, we do need to make sure we're removing any barriers and any perception that people cannot challenge decisions that they disagree with.
Thank you, Convener.
No, thanks very much. And last question from myself. And obviously, we've looked at the responses from the recommendations from the Scottish Government, and you've seen them. Do you think, given what we've discussed today and just from the text as well, do you think it would be useful for the committee to request a clearer mapping of the Government's response to the review recommendations? I see lots of nodding heads. Would anyone like comment further? Thanks, Craig.
Very briefly, yeah, absolutely. I think one of our frustrations with the response, beyond the kind of the content, and I'd say lack of ambition in terms of that longer-term change, was just the format of it. What the timing, as Keith kind of alluded to, was very late, so right at the end of when the government could have published. But it's very unclear. So actually what's been hugely helpful for me preparing for today was the briefing produced by Spice ahead of this session, because if you read the Scottish Government's response, they don't name the individual recommendations in most cases. It's not very clear what they're referring to. It's not really clear which recommendations they're strictly kind of ruling out or ruling in. So actually a much more detailed breakdown from the Scottish Government recommendation by recommendation about what their plans are would be hugely helpful, I think, for the Parliament, for yourselves in the committee, but just for everyone, including ourselves in the sector and people in the public too, because it's just not very clear at the moment in terms of, just reading the document is a bit of a challenge.
Okay, that was really helpful then. No further comments?
I just echo what Craig said there. I think I spent a lot of time creating tables and charts from the recommendations to try and work out how things overlapped and what the timescales might be. So I think it would be hugely helpful. It would also be helpful in terms of the influencing piece I was speaking about at UK government level. If the Scottish Government is setting out, look, this is the map of what we want to achieve here in Scotland, it would help negotiations and I think in planning around that.
No, that's a really good point, Erica. So yeah, we'll take that on board and it'll, and feed it back to the Scottish Government, but also it'll form part of our legacy report, which we're going on to discuss anyway for the next future committee as well. So thank you for joining us today. It's very much appreciated. And that concludes our public business. But before we close, I would just like to place on record my sincere thanks to all the members of the committee. So over the course of this parliamentary session, we've worked through a huge, significant programme of scrutiny, and I believe we've done so in a really constructive and respectful way as well. And again, whilst we've not always agreed again on every issue, I think, from our perspective, members have, consistently engaged in a really thoughtful and serious way, given some of the topics that we've discussed. So I think that's really strengthened the work of the committee as well, and that's reflective as well in our legacy report. So I think this will be our last public meeting today, so I really just want to have that on record. The other thing I would like to say is a huge thank you to the clerks and Spice and the wider parliamentary staff who support the committee. Again, their professionalism and advice, and again, their organisation is what really makes our work possible. And I'm eternally grateful to some of the support and the work that they've provided. So it is hugely appreciated. And I think I speak on behalf of all the committee members on that. And I'll go further and say I think we should be voted the best committee ever. So there you go. And again, finally, I just want to thank everyone for a really great collaborative spirit that's been shown throughout the session. It's been an absolute genuine privilege to work with each one of you. And again, throughout across all the parties, at the heart of it, it's about the people and what is really important as well for the people of Scotland. So I'll leave it at that before I start crying, sorry. No, but thank you, and thanks again to our panel. And that concludes our business. Thank you.